A world without light. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the weight of tomorrow presses against your thoughts, let me take you to a place where darkness was not the enemy, but perhaps the beginning of a different kind of sight. Picture, if you will, the cobbled streets of London in the year 1658. The air hangs thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp wool. The clip-clop of horses' hooves echoes off narrow buildings that lean toward each other like conspirators sharing secrets. This is a world where candlelight is precious, where shadows dance in every corner, and where a young man named Elias Hartwell is about to discover that losing one's sight might mean finding something far more valuable. Elias was 23 that autumn, with ink-stained fingers and a mind sharp enough to cut glass. He worked as an apprentice scribe in a cramped shop near Cheapside, hunched over parchments from dawn until the light failed, copying legal documents and letters for merchants who could afford neither the time nor the skill to write them themselves. His master, Thomas Whitmore, was a kind man with a grey beard that smelled perpetually of pipe tobacco and old books. It began with headaches, small ones at first, like pinpricks behind his eyes when he'd worked too long by candlelight. Elias dismissed them as the natural consequence of his trade. After all, what scribe didn't suffer from tired eyes? But as the weeks passed, the pain grew sharper, more insistent. Words began to blur at the edges, letters swimming together like fish in muddy water. One morning in late October, as frost painted the windows silver, Elias found himself squinting at a document that should have been perfectly clear. The elegant script seemed to dance before him, refusing to hold still long enough for comprehension. He rubbed his eyes, thinking perhaps fatigue was to blame, but when he looked again, the words remained stubbornly illegible. "Master Whitmore," he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "might you examine this parchment? The ink appears peculiar today." Thomas looked up from his own work, concern creasing his weathered features. He took the document from Elias's trembling hands and held it to the light. "The ink is fine, lad, clear as spring water." His eyes met Elias's, and in that moment both men understood what neither wanted to speak aloud. The physician who examined Elias 3 days later was a thin man with cold hands and colder eyes. He poked and prodded, held candles close to Elias's face, and muttered in Latin phrases that sounded like incantations. His verdict, when it came, fell like a stone into still water. "The humours are imbalanced," he declared, with the certainty of a man who had never doubted himself. "The optic nerves are clouded. In time, perhaps months, perhaps a year, the sight will fade entirely." Elias walked home through streets that seemed suddenly foreign, as if he were seeing them for the first time, or perhaps the last. Every detail etched itself into his memory with desperate clarity. The way afternoon light slanted through the narrow gaps between buildings, the precise shade of brown in a merchant's weathered door, the intricate pattern of frost on a window pane. That evening, as he sat by his small fire in the room he rented above a baker's shop, Elias found himself thinking of John Milton. Everyone in London knew the story of the great poet who had served as secretary for foreign tongues to the Commonwealth, the man whose brilliant mind had crafted arguments for regicide and religious freedom with equal eloquence. Milton, who had lost his sight completely by 1652, yet continued to compose verses that soared like eagles above the petty concerns of earthbound men. Elias had once glimpsed Milton from across a crowded street, a tall figure in dark clothes, moving with the careful dignity of a man who navigated by memory and sound. There had been something almost regal about his bearing, as if blindness had not diminished him, but rather concentrated his essence, distilling his humanity into something purer and more powerful. Now, facing his own descent into darkness, Elias wondered if he possessed even a fraction of Milton's courage. The poet had his genius to sustain him, his gift for language that transformed personal suffering into universal truth. What did Elias have? Neat handwriting and a facility for copying other men's words, skills that would soon be as useless as a sundial in a cellar. The political climate of 1658 England was like a pot of water approaching boil, surface tension barely containing the forces churning beneath. Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector, but his grip on power felt increasingly tenuous. Whispers of discontent drifted through taverns and markets like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Some longed for the return of monarchy, others feared it. Some praised the Commonwealth's religious reforms, others saw them as the work of fanatics and killers of kings. Elias, focused as he was on his own private catastrophe, barely noticed the undercurrents of rebellion that swirled around him. But as his vision continued to deteriorate, his other senses began to sharpen with remarkable clarity. He started to hear conversations he would never have noticed before, the subtle emphasis in a merchant's voice when discussing foreign shipments, the way certain customers lowered their voices when mentioning names like Charles or Stuart. By December, Elias could no longer read standard script. Master Whitmore, bless his generous heart, had not dismissed him, but instead assigned him simpler tasks: organizing supplies, cleaning quills, preparing ink. The work was mindless, but it allowed Elias to remain in the familiar environment of the shop, surrounded by the comforting sounds of scratching pens and rustling parchment. It was during this period that he first heard the coded language. A well-dressed gentleman had come to the shop requesting that a letter be copied, nothing unusual in itself. But as Elias sat quietly in the corner, organizing quills by length, he noticed something odd about the man's dictation. Certain words seemed to carry extra weight, delivered with subtle emphasis that suggested meanings beyond their literal sense. "The roses in my garden grow particularly well this season," the man dictated. "I expect a full bloom when the weather turns warmer. My gardener believes the red varieties will flourish especially given proper cultivation and the right encouragement from sympathetic neighbors." To Master Whitmore, focused on capturing the words accurately, it was simply correspondence about horticulture. But to Elias, listening with the heightened attention of someone whose world was shrinking to the compass of his other senses, it sounded like something else entirely. The pauses, the inflections, the choice of words, they formed a pattern, a rhythm that spoke of hidden meanings and dangerous loyalties. That night, as he lay in his narrow bed, listening to the baker's early morning preparations below, Elias reflected on this strange new awareness. Was this what blindness offered in compensation for sight? This ability to hear not just words, but the spaces between them, the unspoken intentions that rode on the back of seemingly innocent phrases. He thought again of Milton, dictating Paradise Lost to his daughters in a house where political exile had become a form of internal exile. Had the poet's blindness similarly sharpened his perception of human nature, allowing him to see more clearly the eternal struggles between light and darkness, freedom and tyranny that played out in both heaven and earth? As winter deepened and 1658 drew to a close, Elias found himself poised between two worlds: the world of sight, which grew dimmer each day like a candle burning down to its wick, and another world, one built of sound and touch and intuition, where meaning traveled on currents invisible to the seeing eye. He did not yet know that his journey into darkness would lead him through some of the most tumultuous events in English history. He could not foresee that his heightened senses would make him witness to secrets that could topple governments and reshape nations. All he knew, as he drifted towards sleep in his small room above the baker's shop, was that tomorrow would bring another day of learning to live in an increasingly shadowed world. But perhaps that was enough for now. Perhaps wisdom, like sight, was something that came not all at once but gradually, one careful step at a time, feeling the way forward with hands outstretched and senses alert to every nuance of the path ahead. The sounds of London settled into their nighttime rhythm around him. The distant call of the watch, the creak of settling timber, the whisper of wind through narrow streets. And somewhere in that symphony of the sleeping city, Elias began to hear the first faint notes of his own transformation. Whispers of dissent. By January of 1659, Elias's world had contracted to a sphere perhaps 10 feet in diameter, beyond which everything dissolved into vague shapes and swimming shadows. Yet paradoxically, this shrinking of his physical world had expanded his awareness in ways he was only beginning to understand. The revelation came on a bitter Tuesday morning when the Thames had frozen solid enough for enterprising merchants to set up stalls on the ice. Elias sat in his usual corner of Master Whitmore's shop, his fingers working methodically through a box of quills, sorting them by touch into neat bundles. The task required no sight, only the sensitivity to feel the subtle differences in thickness and flexibility that distinguished a good writing implement from a poor one. 3 men entered the shop together, their boots stamping snow onto the wooden floor. Elias heard the jingle of coins in heavy purses, the rustle of fine wool cloaks. Wealthy customers, then, the sort who could afford to have important documents prepared with care and discretion. "We require copies of a shipping manifest," announced the eldest of the three, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Nothing elaborate, mind you, simple, clear script. But the work must be reliable. There was something in the way he said reliable that made Elias's newly sensitive ears prick up. Not merely accurate, but trustworthy, discreet. Master Whitmore, ever the professional, assured them of his complete discretion. Elias listened as parchment was unfolded, as his master's quill began its familiar scratching dance across the page. But he also listened to the three men who had moved to the far corner of the shop and were conversing in voices they clearly believed were too low to be overheard. "The shipment from Amsterdam arrives with the next tide," whispered the first man. "Our Dutch friends have been most accommodating in their arrangements." "And the cargo?" asked a second voice, younger, with a slight tremor of nervousness. "Letters primarily, some small tokens of remembrance. Nothing that would alarm the customs men should they choose to inspect. But the contents—" The first man's voice dropped even lower. "The contents carry hopes that have been 15 years in exile." Elias felt his pulse quicken. 15 years. That would place the beginning of this exile in 1644, during the height of the Civil War. But what had been exiled 15 years ago that might now be returning? Property could be restored by parliamentary decree. Religious practices could be resumed by simple declaration. But what required such secrecy, such careful coded language? The answer came with the third man's contribution to the whispered conference. "His Majesty will be most grateful for your efforts. When the restoration comes, your loyalty will not be forgotten." His Majesty. In Cromwell's England, there was no majesty save the Lord Protector himself, and no one would speak of Cromwell in such hushed, reverential tones while discussing secret shipments from Dutch ports. No, this could only mean one thing. Charles Stuart, the exiled son of the executed king, still maintained his network of supporters even here in the heart of the Commonwealth. Elias continued sorting quills with steady hands, his face a mask of concentration on his mundane task. But his mind raced with the implications of what he was hearing. These men were not merely nostalgic royalists sharing dreams over wine. They were active conspirators, receiving communications and tokens of remembrance from the exiled court. They spoke of restoration not as a distant hope, but as an approaching reality. As his sight had faded, Elias had discovered that his hearing had become remarkably acute. Not just louder, but more discriminating. He could distinguish between the footsteps of different individuals, recognize voices after hearing them only once, and detect emotional undertones that would have escaped his notice when his attention was divided between ear and eye. Now, listening to these three conspirators, he heard layers of meaning in every whispered word. The nervous young man was new to this business, his voice carrying the tight control of someone fighting fear. The elder statesman was confident but cautious, a man who had survived dangerous times by never taking unnecessary risks. The third voice belonged to someone accustomed to violence, with the flat, emotionless tone of a professional soldier. "The network grows stronger each day," the elder was saying. "Men who served the late king's father, men who fought at Worcester and lived to remember better days. They wait only for the word." "And Cromwell?" asked the soldier. "Grows older and more isolated. His son Richard has neither the will nor the skill to hold what his father built. When the Protector falls—" The elder man's voice carried grim satisfaction. "Well, nature abhors a vacuum. Something must fill the empty space." The conversation continued for perhaps 10 minutes more, touching on coded references to safe houses, trusted messengers, and timetables that seemed to revolve around seasonal shipping patterns. Elias absorbed every word, his memory sharpened by necessity into an instrument of remarkable precision. When you could no longer rely on written notes, you learned to carry entire conversations in your head with perfect fidelity. When the three men finally departed, leaving behind payment for Master Whitmore's services and promises to return for similar work in the future, Elias found himself in possession of knowledge that could prove extraordinarily dangerous. He was a blind apprentice scribe with no political connections and no obvious loyalties to either Commonwealth or Crown. Yet he had stumbled into awareness of what appeared to be a significant royalist conspiracy. What was he to do with such information? Report it to the authorities? But which authorities could be trusted? Cromwell's government was riddled with spies and informants, but it was also honeycombed with secret royalist sympathizers. A wrong word to the wrong person could result in his own arrest as a suspected conspirator. After all, who would believe that he had overheard such sensitive information by accident? Moreover, Elias found himself unexpectedly sympathetic to the conspirators' cause, not from any great love of monarchy, but from a growing appreciation for the precarious nature of power and the courage required to resist it. His own experience of losing control over his circumstances had given him a new understanding of what it meant to be powerless, to depend on the kindness of others, to hope for better days while preparing for worse ones. That evening, as he made his careful way through the darkening streets to his lodgings, Elias reflected on the strange transformation that was overtaking his life. 6 months ago, he had been a simple craftsman, concerned primarily with the quality of his penmanship and the accuracy of his copying. Now he found himself an inadvertent spy, privy to secrets that could reshape the kingdom. The irony was not lost on him. As his physical sight dimmed, his perception of the hidden currents that moved beneath the surface of daily life had grown remarkably clear. He was learning to read the world through its sounds and silences, its rhythms and disruptions. In losing the ability to see faces, he had gained the ability to hear souls. Walking slowly with his hand trailing along the familiar wall that guided him home, Elias considered the coded language the conspirators had used. Roses in gardens for royal restoration, shipments from Amsterdam for communications from the exiled court. Tokens of remembrance for what? Money, weapons, written orders from Charles Stuart himself. The complexity of it fascinated him. Here was an entire shadow language, a way of speaking that allowed dangerous thoughts to be expressed in seemingly innocent terms. It was poetry of a sort, metaphor pressed into service of survival. And like all poetry, it required both speaker and listener to share a common understanding of symbols and their meanings. Perhaps this was another gift that blindness had brought him, the ability to hear not just the surface meaning of words, but their hidden significance. In a world where political loyalty could shift as quickly as weather, where yesterday's hero might be tomorrow's traitor, such sensitivity to subtext could prove invaluable. As he climbed the narrow stairs to his room, the scent of tomorrow's bread already beginning to rise from the ovens below, Elias made a decision. He would not report what he had heard, but neither would he seek out further involvement in these dangerous affairs. He would simply listen and remember, and perhaps in time he would understand what role Providence intended for him to play in the great drama that was unfolding around him. After all, as Milton had written in one of his political pamphlets, none can love freedom heartily, but good men, the rest love not freedom, but license. Perhaps learning to distinguish between the two required a different kind of sight altogether. The shadow of war. The sound of war came to London not as trumpets and drums, but as whispered conversations in coffeehouses and the irregular arrival of ships bearing news from the North Sea. By March of 1659, the Anglo-Dutch War had settled into the grinding rhythm of maritime conflict, where victory and defeat were measured in captured merchants' vessels and the price of imported goods. Elias, now navigating his world almost entirely by sound and touch, had become an inadvertent chronicler of these distant battles. His position in Master Whitmore's shop placed him at the intersection of commerce and communication, where merchants, ship owners, and government officials came to conduct the paperwork that kept England's war machine functioning. On a grey morning, when the Thames ran high with spring rain, Captain Edmund Hartwell arrived at the shop with a commission to prepare insurance documents for a convoy bound for the Baltic. Elias recognized the military bearing in the man's footsteps before he spoke, the precise cadence of boots accustomed to deck planking and parade grounds. 16 vessels, the captain was dictating to Master Whitmore, including 2 frigates of the line and a fireship. Departure with the evening tide, destination Copenhagen, with stops at predetermined waypoints for reprovisioning. Standard shipping information, the sort of bureaucratic detail that kept London's maritime trade functioning despite the constant threat of Dutch interceptors. But as Elias listened, his heightened senses caught subtleties that would have escaped casual attention. The captain's voice carried tension when he mentioned the fireship, a slight tightening that suggested this was not merely defensive armament. Fireships were weapons of attack, vessels loaded with combustibles and sailed directly into enemy formations. Their presence in a supposedly commercial convoy suggested expectations of significant naval engagement. More intriguing still were the predetermined waypoints. The captain provided no specific coordinates to Master Whitmore, referring instead to the usual anchorages and positions established by previous arrangement. This suggested a level of operational security that went beyond normal merchant caution. As the dictation continued, Elias began to perceive the outlines of something larger than a simple trading voyage. The convoy's timing coincided with intelligence reports of Dutch naval movements that had been filtering through London's taverns and markets. The choice of vessels included several known for their speed and maneuverability rather than cargo capacity. And the captain himself, despite his civilian dress, carried himself with the authority of a man accustomed to command in dangerous waters. When a second man entered the shop midway through the dictation, the dynamic shifted noticeably. Elias heard the rustle of expensive fabric, the soft leather of well-made boots, and most tellingly, the immediate deference in Captain Hartwell's voice. "Lord Pembroke," the captain said, his tone carrying the careful respect of a professional soldier addressing political authority. "I was not expecting, merely ensuring that our arrangements proceed smoothly," replied the newcomer in cultured tones that spoke of court education and aristocratic privilege. "The Admiralty has particular interest in this venture's success." Lord Pembroke. Elias's memory supplied what his eyes could not. Thomas Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, who had served on Cromwell's Council of State and maintained extensive interests in maritime trade. His presence at the preparation of seemingly routine shipping documents suggested that this convoy carried significance far beyond its commercial manifest. As the two men spoke in low tones near the shop's window, Elias continued his methodical work of preparing fresh quills, his ears attuned to every nuance of their conversation. What emerged was a picture of naval strategy disguised as commercial enterprise. "The Dutch expect us to maintain defensive postures," Lord Pembroke was saying. "Admiral Tromp has positioned his squadrons accordingly, protecting the approaches to Amsterdam while leaving the northern routes lightly patrolled. Our intelligence suggests 3 enemy vessels in the target area," Captain Hartwell replied. "Well armed, but not expecting coordinated attack from multiple directions. The timing must be precise. If our commercial associates can draw the Dutch attention southward while your convoy approaches from the northeast." Lord Pembroke's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. This was not a trading mission, but a carefully orchestrated military operation designed to appear as merchant shipping until the moment of attack. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp March air seeping through the shop's windows. He was listening to the planning of what amounted to a naval ambush, a coordinated strike against Dutch forces that would be disguised as defensive action by English merchants protecting their legitimate trade. The ethical implications troubled him deeply. War was one thing, honest conflict between declared enemies, but this deception, this use of commercial vessels as cover for military aggression, seemed to blur the lines between legitimate warfare and outright piracy. Moreover, his inadvertent knowledge placed him in an impossible position. The information he had overheard could prove valuable to Dutch agents, who were known to maintain networks of informants throughout London's commercial districts. A blind scribe with no obvious political loyalties might seem an unlikely source of intelligence, but the details he possessed could save Dutch lives and ships. Yet betraying English naval plans to a foreign enemy would constitute treason of the highest order, punishable by death in its most gruesome forms. Even if he could locate Dutch agents willing to listen to him, how could he prove his information was genuine without revealing sources that would immediately identify him as the leak? As the morning progressed and more details of the convoy's true mission emerged through carefully coded conversations, Elias found himself wrestling with questions that had no comfortable answers. His blindness had given him access to secrets that sighted men would never have detected, but it had also trapped him in a web of knowledge too dangerous to use and too significant to ignore. The captain and Lord Pembroke concluded their business with handshakes and promises of discretion. Master Whitmore completed his copying with his usual professional efficiency, accepting payment and assurances of future commissions. And Elias sat in his corner, surrounded by the familiar tools of his trade, knowing that 16 English ships would sail with the evening tide toward an engagement that might determine the course of the war. That afternoon, as London settled into its daily rhythm of commerce and conversation, Elias made his way through streets that seemed charged with invisible tension. His enhanced hearing caught fragments of discussion from taverns and market stalls, pieces of a larger puzzle that was beginning to form a disturbing picture. The Dutch War was not merely a conflict between nations, but a struggle for the future of European trade. Whoever controlled the sea lanes would dominate commerce for generations to come. The convoy he had heard described represented more than a single military operation. It was part of a broader strategy to break Dutch naval supremacy through a combination of conventional warfare and disguised aggression. Yet as he walked slowly through the familiar streets, guided by the sound of his footsteps on cobblestones and the touch of his hand against familiar walls, Elias found himself thinking not of grand strategy, but of individual sailors who would face cannon fire in the cold waters of the North Sea. English and Dutch alike, men with families and hopes and fears, who would live or die based on decisions made in comfortable offices by people who would never smell gunpowder or feel the deck shudder under enemy fire. His blindness, which had initially seemed like a personal catastrophe, was teaching him to see human cost in ways that clear vision might have obscured. When you could not be distracted by the pageantry of war, you heard more clearly the voices of those who would pay its price. As evening approached and the convoy prepared to depart with the tide, Elias climbed to his small room above the baker's shop and listened to the distant sounds of the Thames. Somewhere in that maze of masts and rigging, 16 ships were making final preparations for a voyage that would test the boundaries between commerce and warfare, between legitimate defense and calculated aggression. He had become, quite without intending it, a keeper of secrets that could alter the course of nations. And in the growing darkness that was now his constant companion, he wondered what other revelations awaited a blind man who had learned to see through his ears. A Council of Secrets. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in April, delivered by a boy whose footsteps suggested both urgency and nervousness. Elias heard the whispered exchange of coins, the rustle of parchment, and Master Whitmore's grunt of acknowledgement before the messenger departed as quickly as he had come. "Curious," murmured his master, and Elias heard the distinctive sound of a seal being broken. A commission for copying, but the client requests that the work be done by, let me see, the young man with the careful hands who sits by the eastern window. Elias looked up from the inkwell he was preparing, his movements suddenly still. No one had ever requested his services specifically before. Indeed, few customers even noticed his presence in the corner of the shop, focused as they were on Master Whitmore's superior skills and established reputation. "That would be you, lad," Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of concern, "though I cannot imagine how anyone would know of your particular circumstances." The parchment that Master Whitmore placed in Elias's hands felt expensive, the sort of heavy vellum used for important documents. But when his fingers traced across its surface, he found not text but a series of raised dots and lines, a tactile pattern that seemed almost like, "It's written for touch," Elias said slowly, his fingertips exploring the unfamiliar symbols. "Someone has created a system of writing that can be read without sight." The message, when he finally deciphered its meaning, was both simple and alarming. "Your services are required for a matter of discretion. Come alone to the Swan Inn at Southwark at the hour of vespers. Ask for the room of Master Fletcher. Tell no one of this correspondence." Master Whitmore listened to Elias's translation with growing unease. "This has the smell of dangerous business, lad. Perhaps it would be wiser to decline such mysterious commissions." But Elias found himself intrigued, despite the obvious risks. Someone had not only observed his condition, but had taken the trouble to develop a method of communication specifically designed for his limitations. This suggested both careful planning and significant resources, the sort of preparation that accompanied serious purpose. Moreover, the tactile writing system fascinated him. Here was proof that blindness need not mean illiteracy, that the world of written communication could be adapted to serve those who navigated by touch rather than sight. The implications were staggering. Entire libraries could be made accessible, correspondence could flow freely, knowledge could be preserved and transmitted without dependence on the goodwill of sighted readers. That evening, as the bells of London's churches called the faithful to vespers, Elias made his way across London Bridge towards Southwark. The journey, which would have taken him 20 minutes in his sighted days, now required nearly an hour of careful navigation. But his months of blindness had taught him to move through the city with confidence, using sound and scent and the feel of the wind to guide his steps. The Swan Inn occupied a corner position near the river, its location marked by the sound of water lapping against wooden pilings and the distinctive creaking of moored boats. Elias entered through the common room, where the familiar sounds of tavern life provided comfortable camouflage. The clink of pewter mugs, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from patrons who had found temporary refuge from the day's troubles. "Master Fletcher?" he inquired of the innkeeper, a woman whose voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing both customers and chaos. "Third door, second floor," she replied, without hesitation, as if she had been expecting his inquiry. "Mind the loose board on the 7th step." The warning proved accurate. As Elias climbed the narrow staircase, his foot found the treacherous plank and adjusted accordingly. Someone had ensured that his arrival would be as smooth as possible, another indication of the careful planning that surrounded this mysterious summons. The door to Master Fletcher's room stood slightly ajar, and Elias heard voices from within as he approached. Not the casual conversation of travelers sharing accommodations, but the hushed, intense discussion of men conducting serious business. He knocked softly and was immediately invited to enter. "Ah, Master Hartwell," said a voice he did not recognize, cultured and precise. "We are grateful for your discretion in coming. Please, be seated. There is a chair directly to your left." As Elias settled into the indicated seat, his other senses began to catalogue his surroundings. The room held perhaps 5 men, judging by the subtle variations in breathing patterns and the rustle of different fabrics. The air carried scents of expensive tobacco, fine wool, and something else. The distinctive smell of leather and steel that suggested the presence of weapons. "You are wondering, no doubt, why we have summoned you here," continued the same voice, which seemed to belong to the group's leader. "The answer is both simple and complex. We have need of your particular talents, but more importantly, we have need of your unique perspective on current affairs." A second voice, older and more gravelly, took up the explanation. "You have been present during several conversations of a sensitive nature. Your discretion has been noted and appreciated. More significantly, your condition has allowed you to perceive details that escaped the notice of others present." Elias felt his pulse quicken. These men knew about his inadvertent eavesdropping on the royalist conspirators and the naval planning session. But how could they possibly have learned of his presence during those private conversations? The answer came from a third speaker, whose voice carried a slight accent that suggested foreign birth or extensive foreign residence. "We have sources throughout London's commercial districts. Your Master Whitmore is known to us as a man of integrity and discretion, qualities that make his establishment attractive to those who conduct delicate business. Your presence during these transactions has not gone unnoticed." "What we propose," said the first voice, "is an arrangement of mutual benefit. You possess abilities that could prove valuable to our cause. In return, we can offer you opportunities that would otherwise be impossible for a man in your circumstances." The leader's words carried both promise and threat, the sort of careful ambiguity that allowed listeners to hear either generous opportunity or subtle coercion, depending on their inclinations. Elias chose his response carefully. "Before I can consider any arrangement, I must know the nature of your cause and the extent of what you ask of me." A moment of silence followed, filled with the subtle sounds of men exchanging glances and making silent calculations. When the leader spoke again, his voice carried a new note of respect. "Fair enough. We represent interests that seek the restoration of legitimate government in England. The Commonwealth, for all its initial promise, has devolved into military dictatorship under Cromwell's increasingly arbitrary rule. We work toward the day when constitutional monarchy will return, bringing with it the stability and prosperity that only legitimate authority can provide." The older voice added, "Your role would be simple. Continue your normal activities, but report to us any intelligence that might prove useful to our cause. Names, dates, shipping schedules, financial arrangements, the sort of information that passes through scribes' shops every day, but is rarely given proper attention." "And in return," Elias asked. "Protection, first and foremost," replied the leader. "These are dangerous times for those who oppose the current regime. Association with us offers certain safeguards against arbitrary arrest or persecution. Additionally, we can provide financial support and access to resources that would otherwise be unavailable to you. The foreign accented voice contributed a final inducement, including further development of the tactile writing system you experience today. We have scholars working on methods to make all forms of literature accessible to those who read by touch rather than sight. Your cooperation could advance this work considerably. Elias sat in silence, weighing the offer and its implications. These men were clearly royalist conspirators working toward the restoration of Charles Stuart and the overthrow of Cromwell's government. Their proposal would make him an active participant in treason, a spy in the service of England's exiled king. Yet their cause was not without merit. Cromwell's rule had indeed grown increasingly arbitrary, and the Commonwealth's initial ideals had been corrupted by the practical necessities of maintaining power through military force. The promise of constitutional monarchy offered hope for a more stable and legitimate form of government. Moreover, the offer of continued development in tactile writing systems represented an opportunity to advance knowledge that could benefit countless individuals who shared his condition. The chance to contribute to such work was almost irresistibly appealing. "I will need time to consider your proposal," Elias said finally. "Of course," replied the leader, "but do not take too long. Events are moving rapidly, and opportunities for those who join our cause early will not remain available indefinitely." As the meeting concluded and Elias prepared to depart, one of the men pressed a small object into his hand. It felt like a coin, but when his fingers explored its surface, he found not the familiar profile of Cromwell, but rather different markings entirely. "Should you decide to join us," the leader explained, "present this token to any innkeeper between here and Dover. They will know to provide you with whatever assistance you require." The journey back across London Bridge gave Elias ample time to reflect on the evening's revelations. He had been recruited by what appeared to be a sophisticated intelligence network, one with resources sufficient to develop new technologies and maintain safe houses throughout southern England. His blindness, initially a source of despair and limitation, had become the very quality that made him valuable to forces seeking to reshape the kingdom. As he climbed the stairs to his small room above the baker's shop, the token heavy in his pocket, Elias wondered if this was how ordinary men became participants in extraordinary events. Not through grand gestures or heroic decisions, but through small choices made in quiet rooms, where the future of nations was determined by the willingness of individuals to accept roles they had never sought. The scent of tomorrow's bread was already beginning to rise from the ovens below, a reminder that life continued its daily rhythm even as the foundations of government shifted beneath the surface of ordinary existence. And somewhere in that familiar comfort, Elias began to understand that he was no longer merely a blind scribe learning to navigate a world without sight, but a man who had been offered the chance to help determine what sort of world that would be. Plague and despair. The first rumors came with the Mayflowers, whispered in market stalls and tavern corners like prayers spoken backward. Ships from the Mediterranean carried more than silk and spices in their holds, the gossips said. They brought invisible passengers that no customs officer could detect and no quarantine could contain. Elias first heard the word plague spoken aloud on a warm Tuesday morning as he sat in Master Whitmore's shop, his fingers working methodically through a stack of documents that needed organizing by date. The customer who spoke it was a physician, his voice tight with the controlled panic of a man who understood exactly what the word meant for a city like London. 3 cases confirmed in Drury Lane, the physician was saying to Master Whitmore. All dead within 4 days of showing symptoms. The authorities are trying to contain the information, but... His voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Master Whitmore's quill stopped scratching across the parchment. "How certain are you of the diagnosis, Dr. Henley?" The buboes were unmistakable, black swellings in the neck and armpits, fever that burned like forge fire, delirium in the final hours. "I've seen it before, in my father's time. This is the same pestilence that took 1/3 of London 40 years ago." The word pestilence seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. Elias felt the temperature in the room drop, as if death itself had entered through the open door and taken a seat beside the fire. His heightened senses caught the subtle change in both men's breathing, the way fear altered the very rhythm of life. Over the following weeks, as spring gave way to an unusually warm summer, the plague's presence in London transformed from rumour to undeniable reality. Elias tracked its progress not through official proclamations, which remained optimistically vague, but through the changing patterns of sound and scent that marked his daily existence. The first change was in the streets themselves. The usual cacophony of cartwheels, horse hooves, and shouting merchants began to thin noticeably. Footsteps became less frequent, and those that remained moved with hurried purpose rather than leisurely browsing. The comfortable chaos of a thriving city was giving way to the nervous efficiency of a population under siege. By June, the familiar smells of London had acquired a new and ominous undertone. Beneath the usual mixture of coal smoke, cooking food, and river dampness, Elias detected the acrid scent of burning herbs and the sweeter, more disturbing smell of quicklime. The authorities were burning aromatic substances in public spaces, hoping to purify the air of whatever miasma carried the disease. The lime was being used for purposes no one discussed openly, but everyone understood. Master Whitmore, bless his loyal heart, continued to keep the shop open despite the growing danger. But their customers grew fewer each day, and those who did come often wore cloth masks soaked in vinegar or carried small bags of herbs pressed against their noses. The normal business of copying documents and preparing correspondence seemed increasingly irrelevant as London held its collective breath. It was during this period of growing isolation that Elias received his second communication from the royalist conspirators. The message came not through the usual channels, but pressed into his hand by a child who appeared at his elbow as he walked home one evening, vanishing again before he could speak a word. The tactile writing was more sophisticated this time, the raised symbols forming complex sentences with remarkable efficiency. The message was brief but urgent. The current crisis presents opportunities for those with courage to seize them. Your services are needed more than ever. The usual place, tomorrow at sunset. The meeting at the Swan Inn revealed a group of men transformed by circumstance from cautious conspirators into desperate revolutionaries. The plague, they explained, had weakened Cromwell's government in ways that no military defeat could have achieved. The Protector himself was reportedly ill, though whether with plague or simple exhaustion remained unclear. More importantly, the apparatus of state control was breaking down as officials fled the city or succumbed to the pestilence. "This is our moment," declared the leader, his voice carrying a fervor that had been absent from their previous encounter. "The Commonwealth cannot maintain order when its own agents are dying in the streets. A well-coordinated uprising could succeed now where it would have been impossible 6 months ago." But Elias, listening with senses sharpened by months of navigating an increasingly dangerous world, heard something else in the man's enthusiasm. Desperation. The plague was not merely weakening Cromwell's government, it was decimating the royalist networks as well. The urgency in their recruitment efforts suggested that their original plans were collapsing, along with everything else in the plague-stricken city. The specific task they proposed for him was both simple and terrifying. Government communications were increasingly routed through unofficial channels as the regular postal system broke down. Private scribes like Master Whitmore were being asked to handle correspondence that would normally pass through official secretaries who had fled or died. This gave Elias unprecedented access to sensitive information about troop movements, supply shortages, and the general state of the Commonwealth's defenses. "We need you to copy everything," the older conspirator explained. "Every document, every letter, every scrap of official correspondence that passes through your master's shop. Our people can collect the copies through established channels, but we need someone in position to ensure that nothing of importance escapes our notice." The foreign-accented member of the group added a more personal inducement. "The plague shows no respect for political loyalties, Master Hartwell, but we have access to certain remedies that have proven effective in other countries. Your cooperation could ensure your survival and that of those you care about." As Elias walked home through streets that grew more deserted each day, he reflected on the terrible irony of his situation. The plague that was destroying London had also created the conditions that made his unique abilities most valuable to forces seeking to exploit the chaos. His blindness, which had initially seemed like a personal catastrophe, had become a strategic advantage in a world where information was power, and power was shifting with deadly speed. The sounds of the city at night had changed dramatically. Where once he had heard the comfortable bustle of taverns and the calls of night watchmen, now there was mainly silence, broken by occasional sounds that chilled the soul. The rumble of death carts making their grim rounds, the wailing of mourners who dared not gather for proper funerals, the distant chanting of religious fanatics who saw the plague as divine judgment on a sinful nation. Master Whitmore fell ill on a Thursday in late July. Elias arrived at the shop to find his mentor slumped over his writing desk, his breathing labored and his skin burning with fever. The characteristic swellings had not yet appeared, but the signs were unmistakable to anyone who had learned to recognize the plague's early symptoms. "Go home, lad," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Lock your door and speak to no one. This pestilence." He was seized by a coughing fit that left flecks of blood on his lips. "This pestilence takes the good along with the wicked. Save yourself while you can." But Elias could not abandon the man who had shown him such kindness during his own darkest hours. Instead, he helped Master Whitmore to his bed above the shop and did what little he could to ease his suffering. He bathed the burning forehead with cool water, offered sips of wine mixed with herbs, and sat vigil through the long nights when delirium brought visions of better days. Thomas died on the third day as the sun was setting over a city that seemed to be dying with him. His final words were a warning. "Beware of those who would use disaster for their own purposes, Elias." In times like these, the line between patriot and opportunist grows thin indeed. Alone in the shop that had been his refuge and workplace, surrounded by the tools of a trade he could no longer practice without guidance, Elias faced a choice that would determine not only his own survival, but his moral standing in a world gone mad with plague and political intrigue. The royalist conspirators had offered him protection and purpose, but at the cost of betraying a government that, whatever its flaws, was struggling to maintain order in the face of unprecedented catastrophe. As the death carts rumbled past in the street below, and the scent of burning herbs failed to mask the deeper smell of a city under siege by invisible enemies, Elias began to understand that some choices could not be postponed indefinitely. The plague had stripped away the comfortable illusions that allowed ordinary people to avoid taking sides in the great struggles of their time. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to accept the conspirators' offer or find some other path through the darkness that had engulfed both his personal world and the larger world of English politics. But tonight, he would sit with the memory of a good man who had died trying to maintain dignity and purpose in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. And in that vigil, perhaps, he would find the wisdom to choose correctly when morning came. Flames of change. The fire began before dawn on Sunday, September 2nd, in a bakery on Pudding Lane. Elias, sleeping fitfully in his room above what had been Master Whitmore's shop, first became aware of the disaster not through sight or sound, but through scent. The familiar aroma of baking bread, which had been his constant companion for months, suddenly carried an undertone of something wrong, something burning too hot and too fast. He sat up in his narrow bed, his senses immediately alert to the subtle changes in the air around him. The usual sounds of early morning London were different somehow, punctuated by shouts that carried not the routine urgency of street vendors, but the sharp edge of genuine alarm. And beneath it all, growing stronger by the moment, was the smell of smoke. Not the comfortable smoke of hearth fires or even the acrid smoke of coal, but the wild, consuming smoke of something burning out of control. Wood smoke, yes, but also the distinctive sense of burning cloth, leather, and other materials that should not be feeding flames at this hour of a quiet Sunday morning. Elias rose quickly and made his way to the window, though his eyes could tell him nothing of what was happening in the street below. But his ears painted a vivid picture of mounting chaos. Running footsteps shouted warnings, the crash of objects being thrown from windows, and underneath it all, a sound he had never heard before but recognized instinctively as the voice of fire itself, a low roaring that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. By the time he had dressed and made his way downstairs, the baker's shop below his lodgings was in chaos. The baker and his family were loading a cart with whatever possessions they could carry, their movements sharp with panic. "The whole street's ablaze," the baker shouted over the growing din, started at Farriner's place and spread faster than anyone thought possible. The Lord Mayor says it's nothing to worry about, but he gestured helplessly toward the window, where the glow of flames was now visible, even to Elias's limited sight. Which direction is the fire moving? Elias asked, his mind already calculating routes of escape. East toward the bridge, but the wind's picking up. Could turn any moment and come this way. Best to get your things and head west, toward the fields beyond the city walls. The advice was sound, but as Elias climbed back to his room to gather his few possessions, he found himself thinking not of escape, but of the documents that remained in Master Whitmore's shop. Weeks of correspondence, including several pieces that the royalist conspirators had specifically requested him to copy, lay vulnerable to the approaching flames. More troubling still was the realization that the fire represented both catastrophe and opportunity for those who knew how to exploit chaos. The royalists had been waiting for a moment when the Commonwealth's control would be weakened enough to allow for decisive action. A fire that consumed large portions of London would create exactly the sort of crisis that desperate men might use to advance their cause. The decision to return to the shop was made almost without conscious thought. Elias found himself moving through increasingly smoke-filled streets, guided by memory and the feel of familiar walls beneath his hands. The sounds around him painted a picture of a city in the grip of elemental forces beyond human control. The fire's voice had grown from a whisper to a roar, punctuated by the crash of collapsing buildings and the screams of people trapped by flames that moved faster than fear. But there were other sounds as well. The organized shouts of firefighting crews, the rumble of carts loaded with salvaged goods, and the determined voices of people who refused to surrender their city without a fight. Master Whitmore's shop stood 3 streets away from the main path of the fire, but the wind was shifting, and sparks were already falling like deadly snow on the wooden shingles of nearby buildings. Elias worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency through the stacks of documents, selecting those that seemed most important and rolling them into a leather satchel he could carry across his shoulder. Among the papers he saved were several that contained information about troop dispositions, supply routes, and financial arrangements that the royalist network had specifically targeted. But he also preserved documents that seemed to have no political significance. Personal letters, commercial contracts, and the sort of mundane correspondence that formed the daily fabric of ordinary lives. It was while he was securing these papers that he heard footsteps on the stairs leading to the shop. Not the hurried steps of someone fleeing the fire, but the measured pace of men moving with purpose despite the chaos surrounding them. "Master Hartwell," came a familiar voice, the cultured tones of the royalist leader he had met at the Swan Inn. "We had hoped to find you here." 3 men entered the shop, their breathing slightly labored from smoke, but their manner calm and determined. In the crisis of the fire, they had seen an opportunity to collect the intelligence they had been seeking, and they had come to ensure that nothing of value was lost to the flames. "The fire has created exactly the conditions we discussed," the leader continued. "Government authority is breaking down as officials flee or focus on fighting the flames. Our people are positioned throughout the city, ready to act when the moment is right." The older conspirator's voice carried grim satisfaction as he surveyed the smoke-filled shop. "Cromwell's agents are too busy saving their own skins to worry about security. Half the government's records are already ash, and the rest will be before morning. This is our chance to strike at the heart of the Commonwealth." But the foreign-accented member of the group sounded a note of caution. "The fire serves our purposes, but it also threatens our networks. Safe houses are burning along with everything else. We must move quickly or lose everything to the flames." As the men spoke, Elias continued gathering documents, his hands moving automatically while his mind processed the implications of what he was hearing. These men were not merely taking advantage of the fire's chaos, they were actively using it as cover for what sounded like a coordinated uprising against Cromwell's government. The moral complexity of his situation struck him with sudden clarity. The fire was a natural disaster that would bring suffering to thousands of innocent people. Yet the royalists were treating it as a gift from Providence, an opportunity to advance their political cause regardless of the human cost. Their revolution, if successful, would be built quite literally on the ashes of London and the suffering of its people. "What exactly are you planning?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the smoke that was beginning to seep through the shop's windows. The leader's response was chillingly direct. While the authorities are distracted by the fire, our people will seize key positions throughout the city. The tower, the Guildhall, strategic bridges. By the time the flames are extinguished, we will control London's vital infrastructure. Cromwell will have no choice but to negotiate or face civil war in a city already devastated by fire. And the people who are losing their homes and livelihoods to the flames, Elias pressed, what consideration do they receive in your calculations? A moment of silence followed, filled with the growing sound of the fire's approach and the distant shouts of people fighting for their lives and property. When the leader spoke again, his voice carried the cold certainty of a man who had convinced himself that great ends justified terrible means. The people will benefit from legitimate government restored. Their temporary suffering serves a greater purpose. History will vindicate our actions. It was then, standing in a smoke-filled room while London burned around them, that Elias understood the true nature of the choice he faced. The royalist conspiracy was not merely seeking to restore the monarchy. They were willing to exploit any catastrophe, any human suffering, to achieve their political goals. They saw the fire not as a tragedy to be fought, but as a weapon to be wielded. The sound of approaching flames grew suddenly louder, accompanied by the crash of a building collapsing somewhere very nearby. The time for philosophical debate had ended. The time for immediate action had arrived. "We must leave now," the older conspirator said urgently. "The fire has reached the next street. This building will be engulfed within the hour." As they prepared to evacuate, the leader turned to Elias with a final ultimatum. "Come with us now and take your place in the new order we are creating. Remain here and burn with the old world that is passing away." Elias shouldered his satchel of saved documents and moved toward the door, but not in the direction the conspirators expected. Instead of following them toward their planned rendezvous with revolution, he headed west, toward the refugee camps being established beyond the city walls, where ordinary people who had lost everything to the flames were gathering to help each other survive. Behind him, he heard the leader's voice calling through the smoke. "You are making a grave mistake, Master Hartwell. We will not forget this betrayal." But as Elias made his way through streets lit by the glow of burning buildings, guided by the voices of people helping strangers to safety, he felt for the first time in months that he was moving in the right direction. The fire was destroying London, but it was also revealing the difference between those who exploited suffering and those who sought to alleviate it. And in that revelation, perhaps, lay the beginning of a different kind of sight altogether. Nay. Rebuilding from ashes, the refugee camp beyond Moorfields stretched like a temporary city beneath the October sky, a maze of makeshift tents, salvaged furniture, and the careful dignity of people who had lost everything but refused to lose hope. Elias found his place among them, not as a victim of the fire, though he had lost his livelihood along with everyone else, but as someone whose particular skills proved valuable in the enormous task of rebuilding lives from fragments. His ability to organize documents by touch, to recognize voices and remember conversations with perfect accuracy, made him invaluable to the scribes and clerks who were attempting to reconstruct the records that had been consumed by flames. Property deeds, commercial contracts, birth certificates, marriage licenses. The paper foundation of civilization had gone up in smoke, and somehow it all had to be recreated from memory and surviving fragments. The work was painstaking and often heartbreaking. Families would approach the record keepers with desperate stories: a merchant who needed proof of ownership for a warehouse that no longer existed, a widow seeking documentation of her late husband's will, children trying to establish their right to inherit property that had been reduced to ash and rubble. Each case required patient investigation, careful cross-referencing of testimonies, and the delicate art of reconstructing legal reality from the scattered pieces of disrupted lives. Elias discovered that his blindness, which had initially seemed like such a devastating limitation, actually provided certain advantages in this work. Without the distraction of visual appearance, he could focus entirely on the subtle variations in voice and manner that revealed whether someone was telling the truth or attempting deception. His memory, sharpened by months of relying on it exclusively, could hold vast amounts of detail about interconnected claims and testimonies. More importantly, his experience of loss and adaptation resonated with the refugees who came seeking help. He understood what it meant to have your familiar world suddenly disappear, to wake up each morning in a reality that no longer matched your expectations. This shared experience of displacement created bonds of trust that proved essential in the delicate work of legal reconstruction. The political implications of the fire's aftermath became clear as autumn progressed. The royalist conspiracy that had hoped to exploit the chaos found their plans frustrated by an unexpected development. The fire had actually strengthened rather than weakened the Commonwealth government. Faced with a genuine crisis that threatened the survival of the capital city, Cromwell's administration had responded with remarkable efficiency and competence. The Lord Protector himself had taken personal charge of the firefighting efforts, working alongside common citizens to battle the flames. Government resources had been mobilized quickly to provide relief for the homeless, food for the hungry, and materials for rebuilding. Far from creating an opportunity for revolution, the fire had demonstrated that the Commonwealth could respond effectively to genuine emergencies. Moreover, the shared experience of fighting the fire had created a sense of common purpose that transcended political divisions. Royalists and Republicans, Puritans and Anglicans, merchants and labourers had worked side by side to save their city. The artificial divisions that had seemed so important in peacetime appeared petty when measured against the elemental struggle for survival. Elias witnessed this transformation firsthand when he encountered one of the royalist conspirators in the refugee camp. The man who had once spoken so confidently about exploiting the fire for political advantage was now helping to distribute blankets to families who had lost their homes. His fine clothes replaced by practical work garments. His aristocratic bearing softened by genuine concern for the suffering around him. "Master Hartwell," the man said quietly when their paths crossed near the camp's main distribution center, "I owe you an apology. The fire taught me, it taught all of us, that there are more important things than political advantage." The conversation that followed revealed how the crisis had shattered the royalist network's certainty about their cause. Faced with real suffering and genuine need, their abstract theories about legitimate government and constitutional monarchy seemed inadequate to address the immediate challenges of human survival. Many of the conspirators had simply abandoned their political activities to focus on practical relief work. "We thought we were fighting for England's future," the former conspirator explained. "But when we saw London burning, we realized we didn't understand what England actually was. It's not the king or parliament or any system of government. It's the people who risk their lives to save strangers from burning buildings. It's the merchants who give away their remaining stock to feed the hungry. It's the ordinary citizens who open their homes to refugees they've never met." This revelation of the gap between political theory and human reality became a central theme in Elias's own thinking as he worked among the refugees. The great questions that had seemed so urgent before the fire, the legitimacy of Cromwell's rule, the rights of kings, the proper form of English government, appeared less significant when measured against the immediate needs of people who simply wanted safe shelter and honest work. The rebuilding of London proceeded with remarkable speed, driven by a combination of government planning and private initiative that suggested new possibilities for cooperation between authority and enterprise. Christopher Wren's ambitious designs for the new city captured imaginations, but it was the daily work of countless individuals, carpenters and masons, merchants and laborers, clerks and craftsmen, that transformed vision into reality. Elias found his own role in this reconstruction when he was approached by a group of scholars who had heard about his work with tactile writing systems. The fire had destroyed several libraries and scriptoriums, but it had also created an opportunity to develop new methods of preserving and transmitting knowledge. The tactile writing system that the royalist conspirators had developed for their own purposes could be adapted to serve much broader educational goals. "Imagine," said Dr. William Holder, a natural philosopher who had become fascinated by the possibilities of non-visual communication. "Imagine libraries where the blind could read independently, schools where loss of sight need not mean loss of learning, correspondence networks that could function even when traditional literacy was unavailable." The work of developing these systems proved both technically challenging and intellectually stimulating. Each symbol had to be simple enough to be quickly recognized by touch, yet complex enough to represent the full range of human thought and expression. The spacing between characters, the texture of the writing surface, the durability of the raised marks, every detail required careful consideration and extensive testing. As 1666 drew to a close, London was beginning to emerge from its ashes as something new and different. The medieval city of narrow streets and wooden buildings was being replaced by a more modern metropolis of wider thoroughfares and brick construction. The political landscape was also shifting, as the shared experience of surviving catastrophe had created new alliances and new understandings of what government could and should accomplish. Elias, working in a small office near the rebuilt Guildhall, found himself at the center of these transformations. His days were spent helping families reconstruct their legal identities, his evenings devoted to developing new systems of tactile communication, his nights filled with the satisfaction of work that served genuine human needs rather than abstract political theories. The restoration of the monarchy, when it finally came in 1660, arrived not through conspiracy or revolution, but through the simple recognition that the Commonwealth had served its purpose and outlived its usefulness. Charles II returned to London not as a conquering hero, but as a pragmatic solution to the problem of succession, welcomed by a people who had learned that the form of government mattered less than its ability to serve the common good. Elias attended the coronation procession not as a political partisan, but as someone who had learned to measure rulers by their response to genuine crisis, rather than their theoretical claims to authority. The new king's promises of reconciliation and tolerance suggested that England might be ready to move beyond the bitter divisions that had torn the nation apart for so many years. As he stood among the crowds lining the coronation route, listening to the cheers and celebrations around him, Elias reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from a simple scribe's apprentice to someone who had played a small but meaningful role in his nation's transformation. His blindness, initially a source of despair, had become the foundation for insights and abilities he could never have developed otherwise. The fire that had seemed like the ultimate catastrophe had revealed reservoirs of human resilience and cooperation that peacetime prosperity had kept hidden. The political conspiracies that had once seemed so important had dissolved in the face of genuine challenges that required practical solutions rather than theoretical purity. And in the midst of all this transformation, Elias had discovered that the most profound changes often came not through grand gestures or dramatic events, but through the patient daily work of people who chose to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than wound, to serve rather than exploit. The new London rising from the ashes would be different from the old, just as the New England, emerging from decades of civil war, would be different from what had come before. But perhaps, Elias thought as he made his way home through streets that grew more familiar each day, that difference represented not loss but growth, not ending but beginning. Echoes of Paradise Lost. The manuscript arrived at Elias's office on a grey morning in March of 1667, carried by a young woman whose voice held the careful modulation of someone accustomed to reading aloud. She introduced herself as Deborah Milton, daughter of the poet, and explained that her father had heard of Elias's work with tactile writing systems. "My father has been composing a great work," she said, settling into the chair across from Elias's desk. "An epic poem about the fall of man and the nature of divine justice. He believes it may be his masterpiece, but—" She paused, and Elias heard the rustle of papers being arranged. "He wishes to know if such a work could be made accessible to those who, like himself, must navigate the world without sight." The pages she placed before him contained excerpts from what would become Paradise Lost, transcribed in the tactile writing system that Elias and his colleagues had been refining since the fire. Running his fingers across the raised symbols, he found himself transported into Milton's magnificent vision of cosmic struggle and human frailty, of man's first disobedience and the fruit, of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe. The familiar words took on new resonance when experienced through touch rather than sight, each symbol carrying the weight of meaning directly from fingertip to mind, without the mediation of visual recognition. As Elias worked his way through the sample passages, he became aware of something profound happening in his understanding of both literature and his own condition. Milton's epic was not merely a retelling of biblical stories, but a meditation on the nature of sight itself, physical sight, moral sight, divine sight, and the complex relationships between them. The poem's central figure, Satan, was described as a being of tremendous visual magnificence who had fallen from light into darkness. Adam and Eve lived in a paradise where perfect sight allowed perfect understanding, until their disobedience clouded their vision and introduced shadows into their world. And throughout the epic, Milton explored the paradox that spiritual insight often came not through clearer sight, but through the acceptance of limitation and the cultivation of inner vision. "Your father writes about blindness with remarkable understanding," Elias told Deborah when she returned the following week to collect his assessment, "but also about the ways that losing physical sight can lead to different kinds of perception." "He often speaks of his blindness as a gift as much as a burden," she replied. "He says it has forced him to see with his mind's eye rather than his body's eye, and that this inner sight reveals truths that external vision might miss." The conversation that followed became the first of many between Elias and the Milton household. The great poet, now in his late 50s and completely blind for more than a decade, had developed a remarkable ability to compose vast sections of verse in his head before dictating them to his daughters or other assistants. His method of composition relied entirely on memory, rhythm, and the internal music of language. "I write by ear as much as by thought," Milton explained during one of Elias's visits to the modest house in Bunhill Fields, where the poet lived in relative obscurity. "When you cannot see the words on the page, you must hear them more clearly. Every syllable must carry its proper weight. Every pause must serve the larger rhythm of meaning." These discussions with Milton opened new dimensions in Elias's understanding of his own journey through blindness. The poet's experience suggested that the loss of sight, while undeniably difficult, could also become a source of unique insights and capabilities. The inner vision that developed in compensation for external blindness might actually perceive truths that remained hidden to those who relied primarily on their eyes. Milton's political experiences also resonated with Elias's own disillusionment with conspiracy and faction. The poet had served the Commonwealth with genuine conviction, believing that the overthrow of monarchy represented a step toward greater human freedom and dignity. But the restoration of Charles II had forced him to confront the gap between political ideals and practical realities. "I wrote in defense of the people's right to choose their own government," Milton reflected during one of their conversations. "But I learned that people often choose comfort over freedom, familiar authority over uncertain liberty. The fault lies not in our ideals, but in our understanding of human nature." This recognition of the complexity of human motivation had found its way into Paradise Lost, where even the rebellion of the angels was portrayed not as simple evil, but as a tragic misunderstanding of the relationship between freedom and obedience, between individual will and cosmic order. As spring turned to summer, Elias found himself drawn into the process of preparing Milton's epic for publication in tactile form. The technical challenges were enormous. The poem's length alone required innovations in binding and organization that pushed the limits of their writing system. But the intellectual rewards were even greater, as each passage revealed new layers of meaning when experienced through touch rather than sight. The famous description of Satan's fall from heaven took on particular poignancy when read by fingers that had learned to navigate their own darkness. Him the almighty power, hurled headlong flaming from the ethereal sky, with hideous ruin and combustion down, to bottomless perdition, there to dwell, in adamantine chains and penal fire. But it was Milton's treatment of Adam and Eve in paradise that most deeply affected Elias's understanding of his own condition. The poet described their prelapsarian state as one of perfect harmony between inner and outer vision, where physical sight and spiritual insight were unified in complete understanding. Their fall came not through the loss of sight, but through the corruption of vision, the introduction of shadows and distortions that made it impossible to see clearly. Perhaps, Milton suggested during one of their discussions, true sight has less to do with the functioning of our eyes than with the clarity of our understanding. A blind man who sees truth may have better vision than a sighted man who lives in illusion. This insight became central to Elias's evolving philosophy of blindness and adaptation. His own journey from sighted scribe to blind scholar had involved not merely learning to compensate for lost abilities, but discovering new forms of perception that had been unavailable to him before. The heightened sensitivity to sound and touch, the improved memory and concentration, the ability to detect emotional undertones in conversation, these were not merely compensations, but genuine enhancements of human capability. The political implications of this understanding gradually became clear as well. Just as personal blindness could lead to enhanced insight, perhaps national catastrophes like civil war, plague, and fire could serve similar functions on a larger scale. The suffering was real and the losses genuine, but the experience of surviving such trials might also reveal strengths and possibilities that prosperity had kept hidden. England in 1667 was still recovering from the multiple shocks of the previous decade, but it was also discovering new forms of resilience and adaptation. The rebuilt London was more beautiful and functional than its predecessor. The restored monarchy was more tolerant and pragmatic than the old. The religious settlements emerging from decades of conflict were more inclusive and flexible than anyone had thought possible. As autumn approached and Milton's epic neared completion, Elias found himself reflecting on the strange parallels between the poet's cosmic drama and his own much smaller story of personal transformation. Both involved falls from one kind of sight into apparent darkness, followed by the gradual development of different and perhaps deeper forms of vision. Paradise Lost would eventually be recognized as one of the supreme achievements of English literature, a work that transformed personal experience of blindness and political defeat into universal insights about human nature and divine purpose. But for Elias, working with the manuscript in its tactile form, the poem's greatest achievement was its demonstration that limitation could become liberation, that loss could become gain, and that the journey into darkness might ultimately lead to a more profound form of light. The tactile edition of Paradise Lost, when it was finally completed, represented more than a technical achievement in alternative publishing. It was proof that the world of literature and ideas could be made accessible to those who experienced it through senses other than sight. More importantly, it suggested that such alternative access might reveal dimensions of meaning that conventional reading overlooked. As Elias prepared the final sections of the manuscript for distribution, he thought about the journey that had brought him from a terrified young man facing the loss of his sight to someone who could help make one of literature's greatest works accessible to others who shared his condition. The path had led through political conspiracy, war, plague, and fire, but it had ultimately arrived at a place of genuine service and meaningful contribution. Perhaps that was the deepest truth that Milton's epic revealed, that the falls and failures that seemed like endings were often actually beginnings, opportunities for transformation that would have been impossible without the catalyst of apparent catastrophe. The paradise that was lost might be irretrievable, but the wisdom gained through loss could lead to forms of understanding that surpassed even what had been lost. And in that understanding, perhaps, lay the seeds of a different kind of paradise altogether. Hanchat, a vision of peace. The coastal village of Aldeburgh sat like a gentle comma at the end of Suffolk's long sentence of marsh and meadow, where the River Alde surrendered its freshwater identity to the vast democracy of the North Sea. Elias arrived there in the spring of 1670, carrying little more than a travelling bag and a letter of introduction from Dr. Holder, who had arranged for him to catalogue the library of a recently deceased scholar. The work was perfect for his circumstances and temperament, organising books by subject and condition, creating tactile indexes that would allow future researchers to navigate the collection efficiently, and preserving manuscripts that might otherwise deteriorate from neglect. The scholar, Sir Thomas Browne, had been a physician and natural philosopher whose curiosity had ranged from medical treatises to explorations of ancient burial customs, from studies of local flora to meditations on the mysteries of divine providence. But it was the village itself, rather than the scholarly work, that provided Elias with his deepest education during those peaceful months by the sea. Aldeburgh was a place where the rhythms of daily life followed patterns older than politics, where the tide schedule mattered more than Parliament sessions, and where the eternal conversation between land and water created a natural philosophy more profound than any written in books. Elias lodged with a fisherman's widow named Margaret Kemp, whose cottage stood close enough to the shore that he could hear the waves from his small bedroom under the eaves. Mrs. Kemp was a woman of perhaps 60 years, whose voice carried the musical cadences of Suffolk dialect and the quiet wisdom of someone who had learned life's lessons through experience rather than instruction. "The sea teaches you patience," she told him one evening as they sat by her kitchen fire, listening to the wind carry the sound of waves across the shingle beach. "It gives and takes according to its own schedule, not ours." My husband understood that. 40 years he went out in his boat, and every morning he listened to what the water was telling him before he decided whether to cast his nets. The daily routine of village life provided Elias with a form of meditation he had never experienced in London's urgent bustle. Each morning, he would wake to the sound of fishing boats returning with the dawn tide, their hulls scraping against the shingle as they were hauled up beyond the reach of the waves. The fishermen's voices, calling to each other across the water, carried news of the night's catch and observations about weather patterns that would determine the day's possibilities. After a simple breakfast of bread and ale, Elias would make his way to Sir Thomas Browne's house, where the library occupied a large room overlooking the village's main street. The work of cataloguing proceeded slowly but steadily, each book revealing something new about the scope of human curiosity and the persistence of the scholarly impulse across centuries and cultures. Browne had been particularly interested in the relationship between scientific observation and religious faith, a theme that appeared throughout his collection. His personal copy of Religio Medici was filled with marginal notes that revealed a mind wrestling with the apparent contradictions between empirical evidence and spiritual conviction. But rather than seeing these as irreconcilable opposites, Browne seemed to view them as complementary approaches to understanding the same underlying reality. This integration of rational inquiry and spiritual insight resonated deeply with Elias's own experience of blindness and adaptation. Just as Browne had found ways to reconcile scientific method with religious faith, Elias had learned to integrate the loss of physical sight with the development of other forms of perception. Both processes required a willingness to accept paradox and to find meaning in apparent contradiction. The afternoons in Aldeburgh belonged to the village itself. After completing his morning's work in the library, Elias would walk through the narrow streets, learning the geography of the place through his feet and hands and ears. The village was small enough to be comprehensible in its entirety, yet complex enough to reward careful attention to its details. He learned to distinguish between the different fishing boats by the sound of their rigging, to identify individual villagers by their footsteps and voices, to predict weather changes from the behavior of seabirds and the sound of waves on the beach. This intimate knowledge of a small place provided a different kind of education from his previous experience of London's vast anonymity. The evening conversations with Mrs. Kemp became a cherished part of his daily routine. She possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from a lifetime of close observation of human nature and natural phenomena. Her stories of village life revealed patterns of continuity and change that spanned generations, illustrating how communities adapted to circumstances while maintaining their essential character. "People are like the sea," she observed one evening as they listened to the tide turning on the beach below. On the surface, always changing, always in motion. But underneath, the same currents running deep and steady, the same forces that have been moving the water since the world began. As summer progressed, Elias found himself experiencing a form of contentment he had never known before. The absence of political intrigue, commercial pressure, and urban chaos allowed him to discover aspects of his own nature that had been obscured by the demands of survival in more complex environments. The tactile writing system he had helped develop in London proved useful for his cataloguing work, but it also became a means of personal expression. He began keeping a journal of his observations about village life, natural phenomena, and his own inner development. Writing by touch rather than sight encouraged a different kind of reflection, more meditative and less hurried than his previous literary efforts. The journal entries from this period revealed a man coming to terms with his condition and finding in it sources of insight rather than merely limitation. "Today I sat on the beach for 2 hours," he wrote in July, listening to the conversation between wind and water. A sighted person might have been distracted by the visual spectacle of waves and sky, but I heard subtleties in the sound that revealed the sea's changing moods with remarkable precision. Another entry, from August, explored the relationship between solitude and community. "The village is small enough that everyone knows everyone else's business, yet there is a quality of privacy here that London's anonymity never provided. Perhaps true solitude is not about being unknown, but about being accepted completely, limitations and all, by people who understand that everyone carries invisible burdens." As autumn approached, Elias realized that his time in Aldeburgh was drawing to a close. The library cataloguing was nearly complete, and practical considerations would soon require him to return to London and resume his professional work. But the months by the sea had provided him with something invaluable, a sense of his own completeness that did not depend on external circumstances or the opinions of others. The final entry in his Aldeburgh journal, written on a September evening as he prepared for his departure, captured the essence of what he had discovered during his stay by the sea. I came to this place as a man defined by what I had lost: my sight, my original profession, my certainty about the world and my place in it. I leave as someone who has learned that identity is not diminished by limitation, but refined by it. The blindness that once seemed like an ending has become a beginning, not just of new skills and adaptations, but of new ways of understanding what it means to be fully human. The sea has taught me that depth is more important than surface, that the most powerful currents run beneath the visible waves. The village has shown me that community is built not on the absence of difference, but on the acceptance of it. And the quiet of this place has allowed me to hear truths that were drowned out by the noise of my previous life. I return to London not as someone fleeing from his condition, but as someone who has learned to inhabit it fully. The work that awaits me there, helping others navigate their own adaptations to blindness, developing better systems of tactile communication, contributing to the scholarly conversations of my time, will be undertaken not from a sense of compensation for what I lack, but from a recognition of what I have uniquely to offer. On his final morning in Aldeburgh, Elias stood on the beach as the sun rose over the North Sea, its warmth touching his face like a benediction. He could not see the play of light on water that had inspired countless artists and poets, but he could feel the ancient rhythm of waves that had been washing these shores since long before human eyes existed to witness their beauty. The sound of the sea would stay with him always, he knew, a reminder of the peace that was possible when one learned to accept the world as it was rather than mourning it for what it was not. In that acceptance, he had found not resignation, but a deeper form of vision, one that could perceive meaning and beauty in circumstances that might have seemed to offer only limitation and loss. As the cart that would carry him back to London rattled away from the village, Elias carried with him more than memories of a peaceful interlude by the sea. He carried a new understanding of what it meant to see clearly, to live fully, and to find in the apparent endings of life the seeds of unexpected beginnings. The journey back to London would take him once again into the complexities of urban life, political intrigue, and professional challenges. But he would meet those challenges with resources he had not possessed before: the inner stillness he had discovered by the sea, the confidence that came from complete self-acceptance, and the knowledge that true sight had less to do with the functioning of one's eyes than with the clarity of one's understanding. In the gentle sound of wheels on the country road, in the familiar rhythm of the horse's hooves, in the gradual transition from the sea's eternal voice to the human symphony of the great city ahead, Elias heard not the music of departure, but the opening notes of a new movement in the composition of his life. And in that music, finally, he found the peace that had eluded him through all the years of struggle and adaptation that had brought him to this moment of quiet triumph. The blindness remained, would always remain, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it had become the foundation for a different kind of sight altogether, one that could perceive in the darkness not absence but presence, not limitation but infinite possibility. And in that vision, perhaps, lay the truest paradise of all.